Yeah, go ahead. Hi, everyone. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. I just did a stream called Empowering Democracy, some hopeful uh, things. And this is a second stream. It's called Empowering Democracy, some unhopeful things. But before I go into the main business of this, I just got a message on my phone. Text that I'm going to read to you because it could become incredibly significant. It says, huge verdict. Insurrectionists can now be banned, from office. Sign to demand every GOP insurrectionist is removed from Congress. So, that is a huge verdict. I don't know whether it can really be used by Congress. I mean, in theory, it could, but Congress would still have to have the votes to do that. And they might not be able to organize those votes or to marshal those votes to begin to remove the insurrectionists. Now, if they were able to get all the Democrats together to remove the insurrectionists from Congress, then that would be a huge thing. I don't know the legal details. I don't know whether the insurrectionists in this instance could, even though they would be thrown out of Congress, whether they would be allowed to run again, as they are running again, right now. So I don't know the legal detail as to whether the case was decided in such a way that it bans them from office for life without special exceptions being issued by Congress. Of course, that would make the other insurrectionists outside of Congress absolutely furious. But on the other hand, it would remove the legislative power of the insurrectionists. It would be extremely divisive, though, and it might increase the probability, of attempts, to other insurrection. But that's a topic for another day. Now I want to discuss three of the unhopeful things that led me to do this stream in the first place. So let's get into that. Give me a second to bring up the unhopeful unhelpful things. The first in this category is an opinion piece by Tom Hartman from Common Dreams. Okay, the second is a report, on lawmakers who delivered some messages to Jay Powell asking, quote, how many millions will be thrown out of their jobs due to Fed policy. That was not very good news for Jay Powell, I think. You get that? I'm not sure it's really an unhopeful thing. It might be a hopeful thing because it might get him to change what he's doing. And the final unhopeful thing is a report on the consequences of the abortion decision by the Supreme Court, which are now beginning to be felt across the nation. So there's a report on that. Let me start with the Tom Hartman piece. Hang on a second. I better share this on Facebook. So perhaps some people will come to this stream. It would be nice if some people would have come to this stream. So, Tom Hartman's piece in Common Dreams is entitled
Can I use the microwave for a minute?
Sure. Trump's violent, quote, a big lie, unquote, politics has aimed harpoon at the heart of U.S. democracy. Okay, I really agree with that title. It is a harpoon. Will we be governed by representatives we elect or people put in office by angry mobs storming capitals? That dependence on trust in elections, that vulnerability of all democracies, is exactly what Donald Trump and his fascist followers are aiming their weapons of mass deception at. Nations have to figure out how they are to be governed. Most of recorded history tells the story of kings, popes, priests, lords, and barons who ruled through violence and imposed themselves on their people rather than the people selecting them. Ultimately, as we all learned in high school civics, you can have a government but chosen democratically with a free and fair vote. You can have a government chosen through brute force and violence. There really aren't any other choices. That was the great American experiment, replacing a violent, hereditary warlord king with a president and Congress that was elected by the people, a democracy. But democracy only functions properly when the people trust that its essential mechanism, voting, is honest and true. And that dependence on trust in elections, that vulnerability of all democracies, is exactly what Donald Trump and his fascist followers are aiming their weapons of mass deception at. But Trump isn't doing it alone. He's following a script that has played out in multiple countries over many tragic years and wars, and is now possible in America and is spreading around the world because of a decision a Republican campaign made in 1964. Our country is also experiencing this deep crisis of democracy because, in large part, the media hasn't been doing their job about this issue of faith in the security of our vote. There's a hell of a history here. Republicans have been attacking the heart of our democracy right out in the open since 1964 and covering it up by yelling about, quote, voter fraud, unquote. It's a phrase they essentially invented, though it was occasionally used by the Confederacy during its later years when they tried to suppress poor white voters who opposed the oligarchy. No other developed country in the world worries about voter fraud, quote unquote, because it's been non existent in most modern democracies. It's not a thing anywhere except in the United States and now Brazil. And it's only a thing here because of this strategy that was developed in 1964. Most countries don't even have what we uh, uh, call voter registration because they don't want a system to try to cut back on the number of people who can vote. If you're a citizen, you vote. You show up with your ID and vote in any polling location you choose. In many countries, because you're a citizen, they simply mail you the ballot and you vote by mail. Everybody gets one. After all, what kind of idiot is stupid enough to risk going to prison to cast one vote out of millions? What possible payoff is there to that? And the one time somebody tries to do it at scale, like the Republican scheme a few years ago in North Carolina to buy a few dozen mail in ballots from low income people in a trailer park, it gets exposed because it's almost impossible to cover things like that up for any period of time. After all, it would take thousands of votes in most places, sometimes tens of thousands, to alter election outcomes. In all the intervening years since Republicans began this continuous and relentless attack, claiming that this voter fraud was happening in Black and Hispanic communities across America, our media has been totally asleep at the switch. Remember the hours-long lines to vote we've seen on TV ever since the 60s in minority neighborhoods? Those are no accident. They're part of a larger program the GOP has used to suppress the vote, to suppress democracy for 60 years now. And guess what? When the Democrats had the majority, they didn't pass any laws to stop that, did they? Probably to keep from offending their white audience and also to prevent Republican squeals of, quote, liberal media bias, unquote. Our news media has historically treated those long lines and other barriers to voting that conservatives have thrown up as if they were simply a bizarre force of nature. Who could imagine why this is, they seem to say, sometimes noting the poll workers in Black districts are also themselves usually Black, even though they have no say over how many voting machines or polling places their precincts get from the white-controlled state. The media's message over the past 60 years has been clear. Quote, Black people apparently can't even figure out how to vote right, unquote. The assault on the democratic system at the heart of our republic has a long history, stretching back to the era when the Republican Party first began trying to cater to the white racist vote. And the GOP made this transition after LBJ and his Democrats passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act just 5 months before that year's November election. In 1964, Barry Goldwater, who was running for president on the Republican ticket, openly opposed the Civil Rights Act that President Johnson had just pushed through Congress. He was doubly opposed to the Voting Rights Act that Johnson had teed up for 1965, but if he was reelected in 1964. At the time, 35.5% of the citizens in Mississippi were black, but only 4.3%. Well, I want to continue reading this list. 35.5% of the citizens of Mississippi were black, but only 4.3% were able to register to vote. Alabama was 26% black, 7% could vote. South Carolina was nearly one-third black, 29.2%, but only 9% of that state's African Americans could successfully register to vote. Alabama was 26% black, but the white power structure made sure only 7% could vote. These were not accidents. From poll taxes to jelly bean counting to Constitution interpreting requirements, most southern states had erected massive barriers to black people voting. These elections, where only white people were allowed to vote in large numbers, were by definition the naked attacks on democracy. After all, it's not really democracy when a free and fair election was held, but in fact, large numbers of people who legally qualified and wanted to vote weren't allowed their voice. How can that not be a crisis for a nation that calls itself a democratic republic? By 1964, people across the country were starting to agree with that assessment, which is why the Civil Rights Act was passed. And producing a lot of angry and disaffected Dixiecrats. Republicans decided it was a great time to pry the Southern racist vote away from the Democrats. Their rallying cry would be that black people were engaging in, quote, voter fraud, unquote. But don't bother looking through newspaper archives to see if the American media exposed this new GOP invention as a fraud itself. They rarely raised the question until the past year or two. I worked in radio news back in the later 1960s and 70s, and I don't recall a single major story mention of Goldwater's racist, vote-suppressing positions and the GOP's sudden use of the phrase voter fraud during that era. And I was paying attention. My dad was an enthusiastic Republican who'd corralled me into going door to door with him for Goldwater when I was 13. Reported on or not, back in 1964, Goldwater and his Republicans wanted to keep black people from voting, and the media was fine going along with them. After all, there was a time when the only black faces on TV were portrayed as criminals, minstrels, or buffoons. The advertising money that paid the salaries of TV executives was only interested in the white audience. But Republican efforts in 1964 were complicated by the civil rights movement and its leaders, like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., African Americans and their allies were marching across the country for their right to vote and had acquired a strong affinity for and loyalty to the Democratic Party that had just put civil rights into law. Panicked, consultants on Goldwater's team realized they needed a justification for an ongoing and even amped up campaign to block the black and Hispanic vote. So they came up with a story that they started selling during the 1964 election through op-eds and letters to the editor and political speeches and on right-wing radio and TV programs like Joe Pines. But William Buckley, would pick it up on his PBS firing line show 3 years later and promote it till the day he died. This 1964 story was simple. There was massive voter fraud, quote unquote, going on exclusively in American cities, where mostly black people were voting more than once in different polling places and doing so under different names, often, as Donald Trump said in 2019, quote, by the busload after Sunday church services. In addition, the Republican story went illegal aliens, quote unquote, living in the United States were using stolen Social Security numbers to vote by the millions. So none of it was true, but it became the foundation of a nationwide voter suppression campaign that the GOP continues to use to this day. A campaign based on a lie of voter fraud, quote unquote, that the media was more than happy to amplify. This lie to disenfranchise black and brown people was the original sin that has brought us to today's crisis. After all, if it bleeds, it leads, and this GOP assertion that the black community uh, that black and Hispanic people were voting illegally was a juicy scandal that the white electorate ate up. For 6 decades, partisan Republican pundits have shown up on TV news programs at election time to opine about America's crisis of voter fraud. For 6 decades, Republican controlled states have worked to make it more difficult to vote and easier to throw people off the voter rolls in Democratic parts of the state. William Rehnquist, for example, was a 40-year-old Arizona lawyer and Republican activist in 1964 when his idol Barry Goldwater ran against Lyndon Johnson for president. Rehnquist helped organize a program called Operation Eagle Eye in his state to challenge the vote of Hispanic and black voters and to dramatically slow down the voting lines in communities of colors to discourage people who had to get back to work from waiting what would become hours in line to vote. As Democratic poll watcher Lito Pena observed at the time, Rehnquist showed up at a southern Phoenix polling place to do his part in Operation Eagle Eye. And, of course, we will do our part to making that clear, to making clear what happened. Quote, he knew the law and applied it with the precision of a swordsman, but Pena told a reporter. He sat at the table at the Bethune School, a polling place brimming with black citizens, and quizzed voters ad nauseum about where they were from, how long they'd lived there, every question in the book. A passage of the Constitution was read, and people were ordered to interpret it to prove they had the language skills to vote. Rehnquist was richly rewarded for his activism. He quickly rose to the GOP ranks, to being appointed by President Nixon in 1972 to the U.S. Supreme Court, and was elevated in 1986 by President Reagan to Chief Justice, a position he used to stop the Florida State Supreme Court mandated vote recount in 2000, handing the White House to George W. Bush. Interestingly, 2 little-known lawyers who worked with the Bush legal team to argue before Rehnquist that the Florida recount should be stopped were John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh. Bush rewarded Roberts by putting him on the court as Chief Justice when Rehnquist died and gave Beer Bong Brett, quote unquote, a lifetime position as a federal judge in 2006. Rehnquist's Arizona arm of Operation Eagle Eye was one of hundreds of such formal and informal Republican voter suppression operations that exploded across the United States in 1964. As the New York Times noted on October 30th, 1964, Republican officials have begun a massive campaign to prevent vote fraud in the election next Tuesday, a move that has caused Democrats to cry fraud. The Republican plan, Operation Eagle Eye, is designed, according to party officials, to prevent Democrats from stealing, quote unquote, the 1964 election. Okay, Republicans charged that the election was stolen in 1960. Keep in mind, that was novel back then. Nobody had been talking about voter fraud outside of a few southern states for about a century. Certainly not in national news. The Times article continued. The DNC chairman, but John M. Bailey has criticized the Republican plan as a program of voter intimidation. He has sent a protest to all 50 state governors and has alerted Democratic Party officials throughout the country to be on their guard. There's no doubt in my mind, quote unquote, Mr. Bailey wrote the state chairman yesterday, that this program is a serious threat to democracy as well as to a Democratic victory on November 3rd. Again, this was back in 1964. But that was about it for the media taking on this particular Republican lie. In the 58 years since then, with the exception of the past year or two, no major American news media has seriously challenged the Republican excuses for blocking black voters or purging the voting rolls the way, for example, Brian Kemp has just done in Georgia this election and last. And now the GOP has extended their campaign against Democrats voting by making it harder for students to vote, allowing, for example, gun licenses as voter IDs, but not state college ID cards, and culling huge numbers of mail in votes through the so called, quote, exact signature match challenges. Millions of votes are expected to be challenged this year by the tens of thousands of Republican election volunteers, and in most states, those ballots will never be counted unless the voters show up at the Secretary of State's office to prove that their signature is still theirs. With the blessing of 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court in 2017, they've also doubled down on caging and voter roll purges, stripping the right to vote from millions just this year alone. As I noted on the hidden history of the war on voting, the GOP has expanded its suppression efforts to women. Those Republican controlled states specifically are the places where exact match and similar ALEC type laws have been passed forbidding people to vote if their voter registration ID or birth certificate is off by even a comma, period, or a single letter. The impact, particularly on married women, has been clear and measurable, as the National Organization for Women now details in a report on how Republican voter suppression efforts harm women. Quote, voter ID laws have a disproportionately negative effect on women, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. 1/3 of all women have citizenship documents that do not identically match their current names, primarily because of name changes at marriage. Roughly 90% of women who marry adopt their husband's last name, That means that roughly 90% of married female voters have a different name on their ID than the one on their birth certificate. An estimated 34% of women could be turned away from the polls unless they have precisely the right documents. MSNBC reported in an article titled "The War on Voting is a War on Women." Quote, women are among the most affected by voter ID laws. In one survey, only 66% of women had an ID that reflected their current name, according to the Brennan Center. The other 34% of women would have to present both a birth certificate and proof of marriage, divorce, or name change in order to vote, a task that is particularly onerous for elderly women and costly for poor women who may have to pay to access these records. The article added that women make up the majority of student, elderly, and minority voters, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. In every category, the GOP wins when women can't vote. Again, these Republican crimes against our democracy are laying around in plain sight, but rarely mentioned in news stories about elections and election outcomes. And the GOP has to do this today for the same reason they did in 1964. Republican positions, both then and now, are not generally popular. Who'd vote, after all, for more tax cuts for billionaires, more pollution, banking, and media deregulation, privatizing Medicare, gutting Social Security, shipping jobs overseas, keeping drug prices high, and preventing workers from forming unions? On the other hand, corporate America, including the massive corporations that own most of our media, love the GOP for the same reasons mentioned in the previous paragraph, which may have something to do with why our media almost never discusses these Republican efforts beyond vaguely quoting Democratic outrage about ambiguous voter suppression charges. This is one dimension of a much larger nationwide campaign of Republican assaults on our democracy, executed through the phony excuse of trying to stop, quote, voter fraud. This year, and particularly in 2024, they're reviving Operation Eagle Eye to have armed white militiamen and DeSantis dystopian election police confront people in their own neighborhoods on election day, all in a craven attempt to discourage minority voting. Doubling down on that effort, they're also stepping up the rate at which they close polling places in largely black communities to further stretch out lines and discourage voters. And they're putting up the billboards across the dozen or so states with anti-felon voting laws, warning that under some circumstances voting is a crime that can land them in prison. Some states have criminalized registering people to vote. The smallest error can now land you in prison in several Republican-controlled states. These laws have killed the multiple voter registration drives in those states. The League of Women Voters recently had to stop their registration efforts in Florida, for example. Well, Donald Trump started squealing about the 2020 election being stolen, quote unquote, after his wipeout 7 million vote loss and being crushed in the Electoral College. The media treated it like a joke for more than a year. As a result, it's now an article of faith among over 70% of Republicans, driving one of them to attack Nancy Pelosi's husband in an attempt to assassinate the Speaker of the House. Thousands of other people who have believed this Republican lie of voter fraud were whipped into a frenzy by Donald Trump to attack the U.S. Capitol. The situation has reached today's crisis point because our media has almost entirely ignored the truth about this Republican scam for almost 60 years. Even today, about the only network that covers the work of people like Mark Elias, Disclosure, I donate to Democracy docket is MSNBC, and even then only occasionally. Mark Twain is sometimes quoted, most probably apocryphally, as saying, quote, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on, unquote. Social media has given the saying a whole new meaning, but in this case, an updated version may be, when a lie is ignored by the media for decades, it becomes a believed truth, quote unquote, that the liars can then use to pass laws destructive of democracy itself into law and through the courts. No democracy anywhere in the world can work if its citizens don't believe their votes are legitimately counted, as we can see today in Brazil. This lie that was merely convenience around the edges in 1964 is now a harpoon pointed right at our elections, what Thomas Paine called, quote, the beating heart, unquote, of our republic. If it's not debunked and destroyed, it could well signal the end of democracy in the America and the beginning of a Putin slash Viktor Orban style fascism. It's beyond time for our media to do their damn job and point out the evil lie the Goldwater campaign buried deep in our collective psyche way back in 1964 before it succeeds in killing American democracy altogether. I thought that was a terrific piece by Tom Hartman. I didn't think it would take that long to read. I apologize for how long. Okay, it has taken, but it was certainly worth it. The historical treatment is certainly worth it and certainly points out the danger of continuing to allow the voter fraud scam to exist. We have to stop it. We have to stop it right now. I'm going on to the second piece, okay, of good news. We have lawmakers to Jay Powell. How many millions will be thrown out of their jobs due to Fed policy? This is from Common Dreams, and it appeared on November 1st. It's by Jake Johnson. A group of 10 congressional Democrats and independents, Senator Bernie Sanders on Monday asked Fed Chair Jerome Powell to estimate how many millions of U.S. workers will be out of a job next year due to the central bank's rate hiking frenzy, which is expected to continue this week as the Federal Open Market Committee meets to discuss further increases. In a letter led by Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts, and Representative Madeline Dean, Democrat of Pennsylvania, the lawmakers point specifically to Powell's disturbing warning to American families in August that they should expect pain, quote unquote, over the coming months as the Fed takes forceful and rapid steps to get supply and demand back into alignment by slowing the economy. Quote, you continue to double down on your commitment to act aggressively with interest rate hikes and keep at it until it's done, even if no one knows whether this process will lead to a recession, or if so, how significant that recession would be, unquote. The letter reads, further quoting the Fed chair, these statements reflect an apparent disregard for the livelihoods of millions of working Americans, and we are deeply concerned that your interest rate hikes risk slowing the economy to a crawl while failing to slow rising prices that continue to harm the families. The letter, also signed by Rashida Tlaib, a Democrat of Michigan, and Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, was sent as Fed policymakers convened in the nation's capital to decide on the size of the next rate increase, which is set to be announced on Wednesday. That is today, of course. A 75 basis point hike is widely accepted. I don't know if that's occurred or not quite yet, marking the fourth consecutive increase of that size, even as a growing chorus of experts and analysts raise concerns about mass job loss. Okay, a basis point is 1/100th of an interest rate point. In other words, the interest rate, okay, is divided into hundredths and counted. So when the Fed institutes a rise of 75 basis points, that is 3/4 of a whole point. If they do the fourth consecutive increase, okay, today of that size, they will have increased the interest rate since they started by 3 points, by 3 whole points, which is a very, very significant rise over 4 months. The hike is widely expected, even as a growing chorus of experts and analysts raise concerns about having massive job loss. Some observers are expecting the Fed to offer pivot language, signaling that the end of demand-crushing rate increases is near, but others, including the Fed's former vice chair, have said the central bank is likely to continue hiking rates in 2023. Experts are calling out Chair Powell on the Federal Reserve's interest rate, the bender for what it is, misguided policy with catastrophic outcomes for the millions around the country who are already struggling to make ends meet. And Rakhine Mahmoud, chief economist at Groundwork Collaborative, said in a statement on Wednesday, quote, the Fed's rate hiking frenzy is doing everything but lowering prices. Wage growth is slowing and mortgage rates are the highest in 20 years. If Powell wants to be taken seriously as a responsible steward of the economy, he should think twice about raising rates again. Powell has been open about the Fed's projection of a higher unemployment rate of 4.4% next year compared to the current rate of 3.5%. But the lawmaker's new letter pushes him to make clear the number of workers who will be impacted by that increase. According to the Fed's estimate, how many job losses in millions would that forecast imply? Warren's office put the question more bluntly in a press release. How many millions will be thrown out of their jobs from the Fed's dangerous rate hikes? Outside estimates indicate that roughly 1.5 million U.S. workers would lose their jobs under the Fed's projected scenario of 4.4% unemployment by 2023. The Bank of America has suggested the Fed's predicted unemployment rate likely underestimates the scale of job losses over the next year as recession indicators blare. The Fed's own economist has also warned of a severe recession induced by aggressive interest rate increases, which critics say do nothing to tackle key drivers of inflation, such as corporate price gouging. Of course, I said that just yesterday. During a press conference following the Fed's September meeting, Powell was asked whether he views more than 1 million additional unemployed workers as an acceptable outcome of the central bank's policy moves. He says, we're never going to say there are too many people working, but the real point is this. Inflation, what we hear from people when we meet with them is that they really are suffering from inflation. Powell responded, if we want to set ourselves up really light the way to another period of a very strong labor market, we have got to get inflation behind us. He says, quote, I wish there were a painless way to do that, unquote. He added, quote, there isn't, unquote. But analysts have disputed and rejected Powell's suggestion that major job losses are inevitable if the Fed is to succeed in bringing inflation under control. Justin Blesh, a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, wrote in a blog post last month that the labor market as of October 22nd isn't that much tighter than it was in 2019. Employment growth has been remarkably even across sectors, and slowing wage growth in low-wage occupations confirms further that tightness is failing, Blesh noted. There is thus little reason to see that today's unemployment rate is inherently more inflationary than it was in 2019. And so those are the various comments on it. There's a lot of disagreement with the Fed chair, of course. That disagreement will continue. Hopefully, the pressure that's on the Fed chair will grow rapidly, okay, and that eventually he's going to have to give in and stop the austerity. But right now, he's imposing austerity on the markets. He's imposing austerity on the economy, and he's doing it in order to benefit the few who are able to benefit from the tight market. So, the third piece of bad news is a third piece of bad news is called New Senate Report Spotlights Barbaric Consequences, quote unquote, of GOP abortion bans. Now, that was to be expected. This is by Julia Conley from Common Dreams, November 1st, 2022. 4 months after the right-wing majority of the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, Senator Elizabeth Warren led several Democratic lawmakers Tuesday in sharing a comprehensive look at the effects of the state-level attacks on reproductive care that the ruling set in motion. The Massachusetts Democrat contacted healthcare professionals at the American Medical Association, Physicians for Reproductive Health, PRH that is, National Nurses United, NNU, the American Pharmacists Association, APHA, and the American Hospital Association, the AHA, over the last 2 months to determine what impacts of abortion bans doctors and nurses have observed. In the report, Warren released Tuesday with Senators Tammy Duckworth, Tina Smith, and Mazie Hirano of Hawaii, healthcare providers explained how abortion bans in states like Texas and Arkansas have adversely affected their ability to care for patients who need a variety of services and have cut down on abortion access, even in
Sorry.
Thank you, Lenny. Okay, so healthcare providers explained how abortion bans in states like Texas and Arkansas have adversely affected their ability to care for patients who need a variety of services and have cut down on abortion access, even in states where abortion remains legal. Quote, in the aftermath of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, this report reveals that the abortion bans and extreme restrictions imposed by Republican politicians have devastating health consequences and threaten women's lives, said Warren in a statement. Warren's communications with healthcare workers provided 5 key findings about state-imposed abortion bans and restrictions. According to the report, such policies affect all women who are seeking reproductive health care, even in states where abortion remains legal, have created mortal threats to women suffering from miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies, and other complications, threaten healthcare providers, and interfere with the doctor-patient relationship, disproportionately impact communities of color, rural communities, and low-income communities, and result in broader restrictions on healthcare and medical education. The report also details how the 15-week nationwide abortion ban proposed by Senator Lindsey Graham would have a devastating effect on women's health and the entire healthcare system. The National Nurses Union, NNU, described to the lawmakers how nurses in states where abortion rights are protected are beginning to see increased patient loads because of patients traveling to these states to receive the reproductive health care they need. Although New Mexico still has 7 abortion clinics that are operating, added PRH, the wait times for abortion at 5 of these clinics are a minimum of 3 weeks because of the influx of patients traveling from the south. Other clinics in New Mexico are so full they have had to periodically stop booking new appointments. PRH also provided a response to Warren regarding patients who have ectopic pregnancies, which can be deadly for a pregnant person if left untreated, miscarriages and other complications, warning that efforts to ban abortion are expected to lead to a 24% increase in maternal mortality overall, unquote, in a country which already has the highest maternal mortality rates at the highest rate, among all the wealthy nations. Quote, consequences of such severe abortion restrictions include providers refusing to treat ectopic pregnancy and providers being forced to wait to intervene until their patient's condition worsens because of uncertainty around what is, quote, sick enough, unquote, to qualify for an exception under the state's abortion ban, unquote. But PRH wrote to Warren. As Common Dreams have reported, numerous patients have already been forced to continue carrying non-viable pregnancies until they reached a state where they could have a legal abortion, or until their condition became severe enough that the legal department at their hospital deemed it acceptable for providers to terminate the pregnancy. This report lays bare the very real barbaric consequences of Republican state-by-state efforts to control women and strip them of their basic rights to decide what happens to their own bodies, said Tammy Duckworth in a statement. Quote, no one should have to cross state lines to be treated as an equal citizen, unquote. Further, bans on abortions and restrictions have also kept patients from accessing non-reproductive medical care, the organizations told Warren. The APHA noted that methotrexate, which can induce abortions, is also commonly prescribed for millions of people with rheumatoid arthritis. Lupus, Crohn's disease, and other conditions In many states, such as Alabama, Arkansas, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Montana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia, the methotrexate is specifically mentioned in state laws and regulations related to abortion care services. Due to the lack of guidance in interpreting laws in many states, pharmacists are unsure of the liability they would face in dispensing methotrexate, despite it being used for rheumatoid arthritis. As Common Dreams reported in July, an 8-year-old girl in Houston was refused a medication for her juvenile arthritis, and other people across the country were being told by healthcare providers they needed to prove they were not pregnant before obtaining the medication. At least 2 patients with cancer in Ohio were prevented from getting chemotherapy before a judge blocked the state's abortion ban last month. They were required to terminate their pregnancies before they could receive treatment, but had to leave their home state in order to get abortion care, having missed the ban's cutoff of 6 weeks of pregnancy before many people even know they're pregnant. The report states that all 5 of the professional associations were in contact and expressed concern that abortion bans and restrictions will worsen health inequities. With patients seeking abortion forced to travel several states away in some cases, said the MMA, quote, access to legal productive care will be limited to those who have sufficient resources, circumstances, and financial means, thereby exacerbating health inequities by placing the heaviest burden on patients from Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, low-income, rural, and other historically disadvantaged communities that already face numerous structural and systemic barriers to accessing health care. Those who are most likely to be forced to continue pregnancies against their will are also from communities with increased rates of actual maternal mortality. The report states, this report confirms exactly what I feared. Republicans' crusade against women's reproductive freedom has created national chaos that is a mortal threat to women's health, unquote, said Smith. And quote again, as I am determined to push back against these dangerous Republican efforts, I will not stop organizing and fighting until women's freedoms can be exercised equally in all parts of this country. Okay, Graham and other Republicans have stated their plans to pass a 15-week nationwide abortion ban as soon as they're able to, a law which will ensure this crisis will get worse, Warren said. Quote, efforts to ban abortion across the nation will continue to cause devastating harm to people and continue to exacerbate this country's maternal health crisis, said PRH. Quote, under a federal ban, the outcomes for pregnant people and people giving birth would be far worse, unquote. So, I guess I have to call attention to the fact that before the decision of the Supreme Court came down, in other words, when it was leaked, but before it became official, there were many articles that warned of exactly the result that we are getting now. The justices, before they finalized their decision, were made aware of the serious health consequences that it would have, of the consequences in death and potential death, and all of the other consequences of creating national chaos. And still, these stubborn Supreme Court justices went ahead and created the chaos and created the harm that will go on and on and on until this Supreme Court is packed and someone else brings a case before a new Supreme Court that rules that the Mississippi decision, Dobbs versus Jackson, was wrongly decided. And once that happens, I think that the justices who made this particular decision should be impeached for judicial malpractice. I have no doubts about that. These people were warned of the consequences of their decisions. They didn't care about taking away the rights of women to choose. They didn't care how many women would die. They didn't care how many women and how many families would be hurt by their decision. They did it anyway. They ignored all the warnings. They took their ideology and they said, fuck everybody else and what they think. We're going to do this. And my view of this is that it was judicial malpractice and they need to be impeached for that. Pack the court first, then impeach them. Retire them for good. Take away their pensions. See to it that this kind of thing is never done by any Supreme Court again. And by the way, the idea of judicial supremacy, that their decisions should trump what the legislature does and what the executive branch does, is profoundly anti-democratic, and we need to reform the Supreme Court such that its decisions are advisory, or at least its decisions can be vetoed by the president and the Congress. We've got to have that. We can't have the Supreme Court actually making these terrible decisions. We can't forget that the Supreme Court in 1857 came down with the Dred Scott decision. That was a precipitating factor in the Civil War. In 1897, in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, it came down with a decision that ruled school segregation constitutional. That is, racial segregation in schools to be constitutional. And that caused a whole new era of Jim Crow in the South, which we had to bear until the decision of the Supreme Court in 1950. Then you also had the Supreme Court justices, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, that blocked the laws passed by FDR in the first of his the New Deal set of laws. When they got a hold of those laws, they just declared them unconstitutional. Now Roosevelt came back at them and passed a second set and threatened to pack the court. And so he won politically. But that group of Supreme Court justices was outrageous. And this group of Supreme Court justices is outrageous. So out of step with what the rest of the country thinks. So, I'm a little over time for this one. Not too bad, though. And K. Ryan said he did it today I take it, Kay, that what he did was to raise interest rates by another 3/4 of a point, right? Okay, if there are no more comments, and I see that only Kay is here. So if there are no more comments from you, Kay, that's going to be it for me until 9 p.m. this evening, when I will have another uh, stream for you. Thank you for coming, Kay. I hope you liked this stream. I was really forcing it. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, and uh, it was hard for me to get through this stream, even though I felt I was doing very important things. I still had a tendency to drop off during this stream. Okay, so I apologize for that. I'll be taking a nap, but later this afternoon, which ought to refresh me for this evening. So I think that will be better. I'm not decided what I'll do tonight yet. There's a difficult stream that I would like to do either tonight or tomorrow sometime. But Kay says, take a nap, Joe. Laugh out loud. Thanks, Kay.